The winter wind had a different kind of bite on the Dakota Territory prairie, sharp enough to cut through wool and bone. Johann Bauer learned that his first February in 1874, when ice crept across the cabin floor just 3 feet from the iron stove, and his wash water froze solid before dawn. He had built his homestead cabin exactly the way every settler was told to, a light wooden frame perched on shallow stone piers with an open crawl space beneath. The root cellar, dug 50 feet away, followed every diagram, every government pamphlet, every word of accepted wisdom. By spring, Johann had burned 6 full cords of precious prairie hay, and what little timber he could find. Still, frost greeted him each morning like an uninvited guest. And he wasn't alone. Across the grasslands, homesteaders were losing the same quiet war. They built by the book, and the book was failing them. Over the next 3 winters, Johann began breaking the rules, quietly, drawing on memories of his German village and observations of Plains Earth lodges. What emerged was a cabin that clung to warmth, sipped fuel, and never again saw frost on its floorboards. He had discovered something modern basement builders rarely consider: how a house behaves when it is truly coupled to the earth itself. In 1873, Dakota Territory was an ocean of grass stretching beyond every horizon. The Homestead Act swept families west with promises of free land and clean beginnings. They arrived clutching pamphlets from Chicago and Minneapolis, pages filled with cheerful sketches of claimed shanties that looked sturdy enough on paper. But reality shifted the moment November winds rolled in, driving powdery snow through keyholes and hairline cracks. Designs borrowed from Illinois and Wisconsin buckled under prairie conditions. Government bulletins and lumber company catalogs repeated the same instructions: build light, build fast, raise the house on piers or skids, keep the crawl space open so wind can dry the timbers. Dig the root cellar far from the home to avoid damp odors. Trust the big iron stove to conquer whatever cold seeped upward. The Hendricks family, settled 3 miles north of Johann's future claim, did everything exactly as told. Their cabin stood on fieldstone piers, 18 inches above the ground. Inch-thick pine planks formed the floor, their gaps wide enough to slip a knife blade through. The crawl space, open on all sides, invited the prairie wind like a guest of honor. Their root cellar, a neat square pit lined with loose stone and capped with logs and sod, sat just beyond the kitchen door. That first winter dismantled them piece by piece. Wind-driven snow packed the crawl space solid, turning the underside of their home into a frozen cavern that didn't melt until April. Frost bloomed across the floorboards by December, thick enough to scrape with a spoon. The children slept on straw pallets balanced atop wooden trunks just to escape the cold radiating upward. Even then, young Samuel's toes blackened despite wool socks and a stove glowing cherry red through the night. 6.5 cords of precious cottonwood and willow, hauled 20 miles from creek bottoms, vanished into that stove. Yet the main room rarely rose above the mid-30s Fahrenheit during cold snaps. Outside, the root cellar fared no better. By January, the pit had frozen halfway down, bursting carrots and turning potatoes to pulp. When spring thaw finally came, meltwater transformed the cellar into a frigid broth that ruined nearly everything they had hoped to plant. The prairie taught hard lessons out here. Some listened. Most did not. Johann Bauer, quietly, stubbornly, was one who did. The Hendricks family sold their claim that summer, defeated and frostbitten, and fled back to relatives in Minnesota. The methods that were supposed to work had betrayed them. Johann Bauer watched their slow unraveling from his rented cabin 2 miles to the south. He endured the same bone-deep cold, but unlike most, he filed away every failure like a craftsman collects tools, quietly, methodically, preparing for a different outcome. At 34, Johann carried a kind of knowledge that few homesteaders on the prairie even knew existed. He had grown up in a German-Russian farming village along the Volga, where his family's brick farmhouse stood firmly atop a barrel-vaulted masonry cellar, cool in summer, never frozen in winter. His father and uncles were stoneworkers by trade, men who spent generations pulling rocks from fields and turning them into foundations that outlasted the people who laid them. From them came lessons about drainage, depth, and the quiet power of thermal mass, wisdom hammered out over centuries of cold-weather living. On his journey west, Johann had paused at settlements near the Missouri River, where he studied the remains of Mandan and Hidatsa earth lodges. These half-sunken homes, packed with thick earthen walls and crowned with smoke holes sized with exacting care, had carried entire families through winters far harsher than anything European settlers had ever known. A Lakota carpenter repairing a trading post storehouse had explained, in halting English but clear conviction, that earth lodges stayed livable because the ground beneath remained steady even when the surface world swung from blistering heat to killing cold. Johann's education continued through chance observations. During a brief January thaw, he climbed down into a neighbor's stockwell to free a frozen bucket. 30 feet underground, the air felt warmer than the wind slicing across the prairie above. On a visit to a German-Russian farmstead in a neighboring county, he stood barefoot on the wooden kitchen floor of a small stone house and felt warmth, actual warmth, radiating upward from the cellar below even though the outside temperature hovered below zero. Slowly, the pattern clicked into place. The earth below the frost line was more trustworthy than the sky above it. Stone and soil partnered with temperature far better than wind and open air. Food storage, floor warmth, and structural strength could all come from the same well-designed excavation. He began to picture a new kind of cabin, one that borrowed warmth from the steady ground instead of battling the atmosphere with nothing but firewood and hope. But his neighbors saw madness, not innovation. At township meetings, seasoned homesteaders warned that digging deep cellars under light frame cabins was practically begging for a collapse. Elias Turner, the carpenter who had raised most of the claimed shanties in the area, insisted that Johann's ideas would trap moisture and rot the floor joists within 2 seasons. The county land agent, fresh from an agricultural college back in Iowa, quoted official bulletins that preached elevation, ventilation, and strict separation between house and cellar as the scientifically correct approach. So when Johann began marking a deep excavation on his newly claimed land in the spring of 1874, several neighbors quietly placed bets on how long it would take before he tore the whole thing out and rebuilt his cabin the proper way. Too many greenhorns had learned their lessons the hard way for them to believe that some old-world theory could outsmart the American prairie. Johann's plan was still rough, more intuition than engineering. He envisioned a deep, stone-lined root cellar directly beneath his cabin, connected by a steep stair and topped with thick planking instead of an open crawl space. He trusted his iron stove and chimney to handle moisture, and imagined that one small vent would be enough to keep the air fresh. The subtleties, vapor management, seasonal adaptation, integrated envelope design, lay far in the future. They would come only after hard winters, close observation, and a willingness to learn from whatever succeeded and whatever failed. The conflict was clear. Conventional frontier wisdom insisted that houses should float above the ground, separated from the earth as protection against damp and cold. Johann believed the opposite, that binding a home directly to the stable temperatures below ground could create something warmer, stronger, and far more resilient. The coming winters would decide who was right. Johann broke ground in late April 1874, when the prairie soil had thawed enough for a shovel but before spring planting took over his days. The excavation required more than brute force, it needed precision. First he marked the cabin footprint, a modest structure 16 feet wide by 20 feet long. Then he centered a 12 by 12 foot square within that outline, the cellar. This was where the deepest storage and the warmest ground would lie directly beneath the living space, with a ring of future foundation walls surrounding it. It was a simple sketch on the land. But it was also the beginning of a quiet engineering rebellion. The digging proved far more punishing than Johann expected. The prairie soil deceived at first, soft black loam for the top 18 inches, easy enough to shovel aside. But below that lay a stubborn mix of dense clay, gravel, and stray fieldstone that fought every stroke. At 4 feet, Johann struck a layer of blue clay packed so tight it rang beneath the pickaxe like dull iron. By 6 feet, thin trickles of spring meltwater began bleeding from the excavation walls, forcing him to carve drainage trenches that sloped away toward a shallow swale 50 yards to the east. Johann hadn't chosen his depth by guesswork. He had listened to well diggers, the men who knew the Earth's temperatures better than any pamphlet writer. A Swedish immigrant who had dug stock wells across 3 counties told him that the soil stopped mirroring surface weather around 8 feet down. At 10 feet, the ground settled into a steady temperature close to the region's annual average. In Dakota Territory, that meant deep soil hovered near 50 degrees Fahrenheit all year, indifferent to July's 90-degree heat or January's 20 below fury. so Johann dug to 10 feet below the planned cabin floor level. When he reached it, muddy, exhausted, but resolute, he began the work that would set his cabin apart from every conventional build on the prairie. Instead of spaced stone piers supporting scattered joists, Johann constructed a continuous fieldstone ledge around the entire cellar perimeter. 18 inches thick and rising 6 feet from the cellar floor, it formed a ring of mass that would bear the cabin evenly and channel the earth's steady warmth upward. This was thermal coupling by design, not accident. The stonework required the old skills, those he had learned at his father's side back in the Valda villages. Johann chose flat stones for the outer faces, setting them carefully like puzzle pieces, then packed the internal voids with smaller rock and clay mortar. The result was a wall that could shed water, hold weight, and remain stable through the seasons. He extended the foundation 18 inches below the cellar floor into untouched soil, anchoring it against frost heave and shifting ground. Above that stone ledge he built upward with sod blocks and timber cribbing until the structure reached the level where the floor joists would rest, a continuous support instead of a scatter of isolated posts. Entry to the cellar came through a straight stairwell descending from the northeast corner of the cabin, tucked beneath the future kitchen. Johann framed the shaft with heavy timbers and lined it with planking, creating a controlled airway between cellar and living space. The opening, 3 by 6 feet, was wide enough for hauling winter stores yet compact enough for a tight-fitting ceiling door that could fine-tune heat exchange. The floor system above departed radically from frontier norms. Johann laid his joists directly on the continuous stone ledge, eliminating the open crawl space entirely. The joists themselves were beasts. Hewn cottonwood timbers 8 by 10 inches, spaced 16 inches on center. Massive, resilient, and slow to change temperature, they formed a floor capable of holding family life, stored goods, and the pulse of the earth beneath them. The first winter put everything to the test. During a December cold snap, 5 nights of -15 Fahrenheit, Johann tracked conditions with a borrowed mercury thermometer from the territorial surveyor. The cellar air held steady at 42 degrees, warmed by contact with its stone and earth envelope. The cabin floor above never fell into freezing territory. Even before dawn, when the stove dwindled to glowing coals, the boards stayed in the low 40s. Johann could walk barefoot across his floorboards at sunrise. Across the prairie, his neighbors' floors glittered with frost. Wood consumption sealed the verdict. Johann burned just 4 cords of cottonwood and willow that winter, against the 6 consumed in similarly sized cabins still clinging to open crawl spaces and proper, frontier wisdom. Johann had not just survived. He had proven that the ground itself, when understood properly, could be the warmest ally a settler had. The deep earth acted as a giant thermal reservoir beneath Johann's cabin. Each evening, when the iron stove ran hot for cooking, the stone and soil absorbed excess heat. Through the night and into the early morning hours, that stored warmth drifted upward again in a slow, steady release. This thermal flywheel effect smoothed out the sharp temperature swings that plagued every other homestead for miles. While his neighbors burned wood as if feeding a ravenous beast, Johann burned less, and slept warmer. Food storage performed better than even his memories of the Valda cellars. Rude vegetables lined up on wooden shelves against the stone walls kept perfectly through winter. Potatoes held firm into March without sprouting. Carrots and parsnips stayed crisp, and cabbage heads wrapped in straw softened only on the outer leaves, easy enough to trim, revealing healthy hearts beneath. It was not just storage. It was preservation by design. Structural stability proved another quiet triumph. While cabins perched on shallow piers buckled, cracked, and settled unevenly under frost heave, Johann's cabin remained square and solid. The deep foundation extended below the frost line into unmoving earth, anchoring the structure where winter could not reach it. Loads spread evenly along the stone ledge rather than concentrating on fragile points that so often caused pier cabins to twist and tilt. By midwinter, word had spread. Other homesteaders began visiting under the guise of neighborly checking in, though their real purpose showed plainly in their eyes. The Olsen family, suffering through a second miserable winter, walked over one January thaw. Lars Olsen, a practical Norwegian who trusted results more than theories, spent hours crawling around the cellar stairwell, inspecting stonework, asking pointed questions about excavation depth, drainage, and stone selection. He left with frost on his beard but something warmer in his voice, cautious optimism. Johann's method was not the only earth-coupled approach taking shape across the northern plains, but it was becoming one of the most promising. Some German-Russian settlers dug full hillside homes, entire living quarters sunk below grade. Others built partial earth shelters with 3 sides bermed in soil. Scandinavian families adapted their log traditions, banking earth against lower walls and laying thick sod roofs for added mass. The deep cellar foundation Johann developed was one solution among many, but it solved 2 of the biggest frontier problems: cold floors and endless fuel consumption. Still, success brought new problems to light. The second winter exposed flaws that the excitement of the first had concealed. Thermal coupling worked exactly as intended, but now the subtleties of comfort, air movement, moisture behavior, daily living rhythms, asserted themselves. Cold drafts seeped through the gaps in the plank floor, chilling the family's ankles each time they sat down to eat. The cabin's outer walls, where the short stone foundation met the wooden frame, leaked heat like a seam in a poorly sewn coat. Even more troubling, the cabin's interior air stratified sharply, hot near the ceiling, cool near the floor. Johann could feel it vividly during long evenings by lamplight, warmth gathering above his head, a creeping chill drifting up through the floorboards. The single-layer pine floor, with the typical frontier gaps between boards, allowed too much air exchange between the cellar and the living space. When Johann sat reading in the evening, he could feel slender currents of cool air rising through every joint, collecting around his feet like restless spirits of the cold earth below. Maria complained that her spinning wheel, set near the outer wall, remained icy to the touch even when the stove glowed cherry red barely 8 feet away. The system worked, but it was imperfect. And Johann, as always, was already turning the flaws into the next lessons. Johann noted the changes almost immediately. On the first morning of the storm, when the wind roared across the open prairie like a passing freight train, he held a tallow candle near the floorboards where drafts had once crept through. The flame stood nearly upright. Only the faintest tremble suggested any air movement at all. By midday, when the wind gusts battered the cabin with enough force to rattle the window shutters and send loose snow sifting under the eaves, the interior temperature remained steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, cold by modern standards, but a remarkable improvement for a frontier winter with minimal fuel expenditure. Maria, who had been skeptical of the extensive earthworks and weeks of labor the sod skirt required, admitted quietly that she could feel the difference most clearly near the cradle. In previous storms she had needed to wrap the infant in additional quilts and keep the cradle close to the stove. Now, positioned in the warmer half of the room above the cellar, the baby slept without fussing, even during the sharpest night gusts. The older children, who instinctively gravitated toward the central area of the cabin in the past, now wandered freely during chores and play, no longer avoiding the spaces near the outer walls. Late on the second night of the storm, Johann stepped outside to assess the condition of the new berm. He fought through snow that stung his face like blown sand, shielding his lantern while moving along the cabin perimeter. The sod skirt had shed most of the snow, and where drifts had formed along the slope, they lay neatly rather than piling against the wooden siding. The clay-coated surface had frozen into a smooth crust, resisting erosion from the wind. Water would not seep into the foundation when the thaw eventually came. When the storm finally ended on the third afternoon, neighbors began riding or walking out to check on one another, as was customary whenever severe weather struck. Hagen arrived first, his wool coat stiff with frost and his beard full of ice crystals. He stepped inside, removed his gloves, and immediately remarked on the stable warmth. "You've done it right," he said after inspecting the base of the walls and stamping the remaining snow from his boots. "Most men think a thicker wall means a warmer house. It's the ground that keeps you alive in this country, not the timber." The Muller family came the following day to share news from further down the valley. Several homesteaders without earthen banking had experienced freezing along their floor joints, and one cabin had developed ice inside the corner seams where wind forced snow into tiny gaps. Johann listened carefully, committing each account to memory, not out of pride for his own improvements, but out of a continued desire to refine his methods. He believed the prairie offered all the materials necessary for a stable, efficient shelter, if one learned how to read its patterns. By the end of March, word of Johann's successful modifications had spread across the township. A few families requested his help in planning similar berms and double-floor systems before the next winter. Johann agreed, stipulating that each structure required thoughtful adaptation to the land, not simply copying his design. Soil types varied across the region. Drainage patterns changed even within a few hundred yards. What worked at his cabin might need small but crucial adjustments elsewhere. Still, the principle held. The earth itself, if treated with respect and understanding, could serve as both shield and reservoir, storing the summer's warmth and releasing it slowly through the cruelest months of the year. And Johann, once simply another struggling settler on the frontier, gradually became known as a man who could coax a measure of comfort out of a land more often associated with hardship. The commissary's caretaker, an older sergeant who had spent 2 decades in frontier posts from Nebraska to the Dakotas, explained the system with matter-of-fact precision. Unlike many civilian root cellars, the commissary maintained 2 distinct air pathways, a low inlet vent set near ground level on the north wall, and a high outlet vent rising through a short stovepipe-like chase on the opposite side. The sergeant emphasized that the key was not the size of the openings, but the vertical separation between them. A difference of even 3 feet created a natural convection cycle. Cold, dense air entered low, pushing warmer, humid air upward and out through the higher flue. "It's not the draft you feel that does the work," he told Johann while tapping the wooden vent frame. "It's the draft you don't notice. Slow air makes for steady conditions. Fast air just shocks your stores." This lesson stayed with Johann on the 2-day ride home. Back at the cabin, he began the spring of 1877 by carefully studying the cellar's microclimate. He hung simple tools of his own making, a strip of rawhide to gauge humidity by stiffness, a tin can catch pan to measure condensation dripping from the joists, and a length of muslin near the floor to determine where the coldest air pooled. Over several weeks he confirmed what the sergeant had described. The cellar lacked convective movement altogether. The tightly sealed stairwell door and near-airtight floor system had improved thermal efficiency but at the cost of air renewal. Drawing from both the commissary example and Hagen's earlier lessons about drainage, Johann drafted a ventilation plan that balanced air exchange with temperature stability. His design called for 2 controlled passages. 1. A low, north-facing intake shaft, dug horizontally through the earth berm and reinforced with short sections of salvaged barrel staves. This would admit the coldest and driest external air while minimizing heat loss. 2. A high, south-facing outlet vent, rising through an insulated wooden flue that terminated just below the eaves. The south exposure allowed the sun to warm the upper section slightly, enhancing upward air movement even on marginal days. Construction took place in early May, when the ground was soft but before the heat of summer threatened the stored vegetables. Johann excavated the intake tunnel first, carefully sloping it slightly upward toward the cellar interior to prevent water infiltration. At the outer mouth he installed a hinged wooden flap, simple, but enough to regulate flow during blizzards. The outlet vent required more care. He built a 2-by-3-foot chase that was insulated with packed straw and clay, then lined the interior with smooth plain boards to reduce friction and encourage consistent airflow. By mid-June, the system was complete. Johann expected immediate results, but the changes were subtle at first. The cellar did not suddenly feel drier. Instead, the rawhide humidity strip stiffened slightly over several cool nights, indicating a slow but definite reduction in moisture. The musty odor faded within a week, replaced by the neutral earth smell typical of well-regulated storage rooms. Most telling, the next batch of potatoes stored after harvest remained fully dormant deep into early winter, their skins firm and unblemished. Inside the cabin, air quality improved as well. The oppressive stillness that had settled on windless days began to dissipate. Cooking odors no longer lingered for hours, and Maria noted gratefully that laundry dried faster on its indoor line. The family still maintained the habit of cracking the door or window during particularly heavy cooking, but the background air exchange now worked continuously without noticeable drafts. As the 3rd winter arrived, Johann monitored the system closely during the first cold snap. Despite outside temperatures falling to 10 below zero and the sod skirt once again crusted with wind-driven snow, the cellar held steady at 38 to 40 degrees. Moisture no longer condensed heavily on the floor joists. Instead, a faint and evenly distributed dampness appeared only during warm spells, then dried out naturally as the convection cycle restored balance. The cabin had entered a new phase, no longer merely a shelter modified to survive the prairie's extremes, but a finely tuned living structure that blended earth, wood, and controlled air flows into a resilient whole. Yet even with these advances, Johann sensed future refinements waiting to be discovered. The frontier was a place of constant adaptation, and each improvement carried within it the seeds of the next problem to solve. The change became most noticeable during the dog days of late July, when still, humid air often settled over the prairie like a heavy blanket. In previous summers, the cabin interior had grown stifling after midday cooking, with warm air accumulating under the low rafters and refusing to disperse until long after sunset. But with the new high-low circulation paths operating continuously, the oppressive stagnation never developed. Even on days when the outside thermometer at the agency read 93 degrees, Johann found the cabin's air surprisingly fresh. Maria, who had once resigned herself to afternoon headaches brought on by the heat, remarked that the interior now felt more like late spring than midsummer. The stove, too, behaved differently. During cool evenings, when they lit small cooking fires rather than full heating charges, Johann noticed the flame burn steadier and more cleanly than before. Less smoke crept back into the room at kindling time. Horn's teachings from Earth Lodge practice echoed in Johann's mind. A fire always draws best when supplied with air from below rather than stealing it through cracks and gaps. The paired ducts had not only improved the cellar but given the entire house a controlled breathing rhythm. By August, Johann began to realize that his homestead had crossed an important threshold. The structure no longer fought the climate, it partnered with it. The earth handled temperature, the ducts managed air, and the sod skirt provided a buffer against both wind and moisture. These pieces, once separate experiments, had become an integrated system. But success brought new questions. With cooler, drier cellar air rising through the outlet shaft on a steady draft, Johann found himself wondering how much heat the system carried off in winter. The Army circular had warned of excessive venting in cold seasons, advising the use of dampers to maintain a balance between fresh air and fuel economy. Johann spent several evenings sketching diagrams by lamplight, estimating airflow by holding a strip of paper near the duct openings and tracking how strongly it pulled. He began introducing adjustments. On mild autumn days, the damper stayed wide open, allowing a full exchange of air to maintain ideal storage conditions for the year's harvest. But once frost began to form on the sod skirt in early October, Johann partially closed the exhaust vent to slow the movement of warm air upward. This preserved precious heat while still letting the cellar breathe. He soon developed a habit of tuning the vents each morning, much like a farmer adjusting draft on a plow. The true test of balance came that winter. By late December of 1876, the northern plains experienced a pattern of cold snaps with nighttime temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. Yet, despite the severity, Johann's cabin maintained its now typical stability. Humidity remained under control, no beading of water formed on the underside of the floorboards, and the cabbage stayed crisp well into January. The potatoes slept soundly in their bins, no early sprouting, no softening, no mold along their skins. Even the carrots, which in previous years had tended to dry out or rubberize, held firm with a faint sweetness that Maria praised during supper preparations. Inside the living space, the improvements synergized with earlier modifications. The double floor and moderated cellar temperatures meant the boards never developed the brittle coldness that tormented other families. And the gentle upward pull of stale air through the exhaust vent subtly encouraged fresh air to enter lower cracks in a controlled manner. The cabin, now breathing slowly but steadily, avoided both the stagnant heaviness of Johann's second winter and the drafts of his first. Yet some issues persisted, small ones, but meaningful. Maria pointed out that the corner near her spinning wheel still felt cooler than the rest of the room on windy days. Johann noticed that smoke from the lamp sometimes leaned toward the north wall, suggesting minor depressurization when gusts struck the cabin. These were not failures, but clues, signs that pressure differentials, wind effects, and internal temperature gradients were interacting in ways he had not fully anticipated. It was during these observations that Johann began contemplating an idea he had heard only in passing from Horn: a passive mixing chimney, a feature used in larger earth lodges to break up stratified air layers without major heat loss. He wondered whether a small, insulated interior shaft could redistribute warm air accumulating near the ceiling back toward the floor. The concept stayed in his thoughts as January deepened. Johann realized he was entering yet another phase of adaptation. His work had solved the foundational issues of temperature, drafts, and humidity, but true comfort on the plains required mastering the subtler interactions of air movement, an art less visible than stonework or carpentry, but no less critical. The next evolution of the cabin would begin not with a crisis but with curiosity. The Larsen children huddled atop their kitchen table wrapped in quilts, too frightened to sleep as frost crept across the inner wall planks in feathered, crystalline patterns. The Henderson family fared little better. Their improved but still shallow foundation transmitted the storm's full fury into the floor structure. By dawn of the second day, Henderson reported that eggs stored in a corner cabinet had frozen solid, cracking their shells from expanding ice. The cabin's interior, despite a roaring fire, felt more like an unheated barn than a dwelling meant to shelter human beings. Farther east, the McAvoy brothers, two Irish bachelors homesteading on adjoining quarter sections, survived only by retreating into their stock barn and bedding down between their two cows, who provided a living source of heat as the temperature outside plummeted toward 50 below. When neighbors later asked why they hadn't stayed in their cabin, the elder McAvoy simply replied, "The house was colder than the barn, and the wind blew right through it." The contrast with Johann's cabin was unmistakable. During the worst hours of the blizzard, when wind gusts shook the roof timbers and polished the snow into hard, stinging grains, Johann noted that the interior temperature fell only 6 degrees from its pre-storm baseline, and never once dropped into the danger zone where frost could form on inner surfaces. Maria remained calm, tending the stove in short bursts rather than continuous feeding. The children slept soundly on their rope beds, oblivious to the howl outside. Johann's thermometers, read carefully every 2 hours, showed a system behaving exactly as it had been designed to behave, storing heat, limiting loss, and providing enough fresh air to keep conditions healthy without sacrificing thermal stability. Only once did Johann feel genuine concern, when a brief shift in wind direction caused the exhaust vent to flutter, reducing its draft. He responded by cracking the low intake damper an additional half-inch, restoring balanced flow. The adjustment worked immediately, and the cabin's interior air lost its brief heaviness. This, too, became a lesson he recorded in his notebook. Even the most resilient systems require mindful tending under extraordinary conditions. When the blizzard finally broke on the morning of January 14th, the prairie emerged as a white, wind-sculpted wasteland. Drifts swallowed fences, buried outbuildings, and in some places reached the eaves of single-story cabins. The air remained bitter, 12 below at sunrise, but the wind had died to a gentle sigh. Johann stepped outside to assess the storm's damage and found his sod skirt encased in a hard shell of drifted snow that had actually improved its insulating value. The exhaust stack rose cleanly above the roofline, its cap free of ice. On the lee side, snow had packed so tightly against the cabin that it formed a secondary embankment, an accidental but effective additional insulation layer. Johann spent the next 2 days visiting neighboring homesteads, in some cases shoveling through massive drifts to reach doors that opened only to solid walls of snow. He found families shaken, exhausted, and in several cases suffering early signs of frostbite. The Larsens' water barrel had frozen almost solid. The Henderson cabin interior was so cold that bread left on the table had become hard as stone. Even the Olsens, who had begun experimenting with an earth berm on Johann's advice, discovered that gaps in their hurried construction allowed wind-driven snow to infiltrate the skirt and melt later against the logs. A moisture problem Johann knew would require attention before spring thaw. Word of Johann's cabin performance spread quickly through the township. During the first Sunday gathering after the storm, held in the drafty schoolhouse warmed by a single iron stove, neighbors approached Johann with questions, notebooks, and in some cases sketches of their own building ideas. Even the skeptical Elias Turner, who had long insisted that Johann's deep cellar approach was German foolishness, admitted with a wry grin, "It seems your foolishness has a mind for weather I do not." For the first time since arriving in Dakota Territory, Johann found himself viewed not just as an eccentric builder but as the closest thing the community had to a frontier engineer. The blizzard had done more than test his system. It had demonstrated that the difference between survival and disaster could hinge on the subtleties of foundation depth, air movement, thermal mass, and drainage, concepts most settlers had never considered until forced to by the storm's brutality. That winter marked a turning point. Several families requested Johann's help designing retrofits, some modest, like adding controlled ventilation ducts to root cellars, others ambitious, like converting existing cabins to earth-coupled foundations once the weather permitted digging. Johann accepted each request with humility, careful not to overstate what his system could accomplish. "The earth will help you," he told them, "but it must be respected. Dig where water will not stand. Ventilate where air will not stagnate. Insulate where wind will cut." These principles, once born of necessity, now began to shape the building culture of the surrounding settlement. As the snows slowly melted in early March of 1888, and the prairie wind shifted into its raw spring form, Johann prepared to tackle a new challenge revealed by the storm: wind-driven infiltration along the cabin's upper walls, a weakness that earth coupling alone could not solve. The next phase of his frontier engineering would require not only soil and stone, but careful attention to the structure's wooden superframe and the dynamics of pressure on the high prairie. And so, with winter ending, Johann began planning the improvements that would carry his home, and the homes of his neighbors, into a new era of resilient frontier construction. In the months that followed, Johann found himself unexpectedly at the center of growing local interest. What had begun as a quiet personal project, merely a practical way to protect his family and their food, had become an informal model for the settlement's future construction. Neighbors visited under the pretense of borrowing tools or asking after livestock, only to steer the conversation toward foundation depths, duct dimensions, and the precise pitch of the exhaust hood above his roofline. Johann, never one to boast, answered their questions patiently, often guiding them down into the cellar so they could see the system firsthand. The walls still held their winter chill, but the air remained clear and dry, proof of the circulation that had sustained his stores through the blizzard. Interest soon spread beyond the nearest homesteads. In early spring, the county surveyor arrived with 2 assistants, claiming he wished to verify property boundaries while the ground was still firm. But during a pause in the measuring, he confessed that reports of Johann's earthbound structure had reached the land office, and he wanted to evaluate the approach himself. He spent an hour sketching the cellar and foundation layout in a leather-bound notebook, asking questions about excavation depth, stone selection, and the damper's seasonal adjustments. Before departing, he mentioned that the Territorial Agricultural Board had recently begun seeking examples of climate-adapted building methods suitable for publication in their annual circular. Johann dismissed the idea politely. He viewed his cellar as practical work, not something fit for the printed page. Yet word continued to spread, carried by travelers, by supply wagons, and by the homesteaders who frequented the trading posts through the thawing months. When the spring immigration meeting was held at the county schoolhouse, a gathering where new arrivals shared challenges and veterans offered guidance, the deep cellar method became a topic of earnest debate. Younger families, mindful of food losses suffered during the blizzard, pressed the county carpenter to explain why raised foundations remained the standard recommendation. Older settlers, recalling hard winters in Norway, Sweden, and Germany, nodded approvingly as Johann's layout was described in detail, remarking that their own ancestors had long relied on similar ground-link designs. By midsummer, experimental construction began across the township. Houghton dug the first of the new generation of cellars, choosing a site where the subsoil held more sand than clay and would drain readily after heavy rains. Rather than copying Johann's design exactly, he adapted it to his own needs, enlarging the storage area and placing the intake shaft on the west side to take advantage of breezes that swept across his ridge. Others followed suit, borrowing the essential principles: deep excavation, continuous stone foundation, paired shafts, while tailoring dimensions and materials to their homestead's layouts. Some added small side chambers for storing milk or butter. Others incorporated shallow alcoves near the ceiling to hang smoked meats. Through all this activity, Johann remained quietly observant. He cautioned neighbors about the dangers of digging too close to surface drainage paths, and warned that placing the exhaust duct too far from the stovepipe would weaken winter draft. He shared the Army's ventilation guidelines when asked but never insisted on strict adherence, knowing that each homestead differed in soil, wind, and heating arrangements. As he walked from farm to farm, watching new cellars rise beneath half-finished houses, he recognized that the prairie was beginning to develop a hybrid building culture, one that blended military science, immigrant memory, and indigenous environmental knowledge into something uniquely suited to the region's punishing climate. Autumn confirmed the shift. During the harvest fairs, stories circulated describing how new cellars held steady temperatures even during late-season cold snaps. Families who had suffered catastrophic food losses the previous winter now boasted of bins filled with well-preserved potatoes, cabbages, and turnips. Where once raised foundations had symbolized proper American construction, deep foundations began to signal prudence, foresight, and a certain frontier wisdom. Local merchants, noticing the trend, stocked more stone chisels, barrel hoops, and pitch tins. The blacksmith forged custom brackets for vent hoods, and even the freight company began advertising shipments of dressed limestone from quarries 80 miles to the east. As winter approached once again, the landscape bore visible evidence of Johann's quiet influence. New cabins rested more heavily in the earth, their low profiles merging with the prairie contours. Small vent hoods dotted rooftops like sober wooden chimneys, and the rapping winds carried the faint, steady sigh of air exchanging through carefully crafted shafts. But the greatest test was yet to come, for the coming winter would bring its own trials, and reveal whether these new structures, inspired by a single homesteader's synthesis of knowledge, could truly withstand the relentlessness of the northern plains.